In this video, we're going to look at how to blend 3 exposures using Lumi 32. Now when doing that, I almost always have a brighter exposure which I place on top, and you should see some JPEGs for these images in your download. So I usually have a brighter exposure on top, a darker exposure in the middle, and a base exposure on the bottom. Now going back to what I said in an earlier video, this darker exposure is far too dark. Realistically, we should have one which is at least 1 stop brighter to make the blending much smoother. But unfortunately, back then I was using a cheaper Canon which only allowed me to bracket for 3 exposures, so I didn't capture a brighter exposure. And these are the 3 exposures that I came out with. But that isn't going to be a problem because this is a relatively simple scene to blend and we can reduce the opacity of this darker exposure without any problems. Now, our goal here is of course to bring back the overexposed sky in the base exposure and also the clip shadows in the foreground here. And of course we have enough information in the darker exposure to bring back the sky and enough information in the brighter exposure to bring back the foreground. So the first thing I would do is I would choose my darker exposure, hold down Alt on a PC or Option on a Mac and create a black mask. Then I would go to Lumi 32 and I'm going to build the mask, of course, around the base exposure because that gives us a good selection of the sky that we need to blend. Now, since this, just like our Dubai photo in the last image, is a blue sky with a nice gradient, we need to have a softer mask, not a contrasting mask. So ideally, we would have the foreground really dark, darker than this I'd say, and the sky brighter. So let's just add a little bit more contrast to this mask. So that was a brights one, and then I've increased smoothness to 50. And now we've cancelled out all of the foreground. So that shouldn't be affected when we brush in the change. But of course we've selected all of the sky and some of the water here. So I can press select, and of course we get our marching ants. Then I can choose my brush, or you can press B, and we can choose a white foreground brush. Press Command and H or Control and H to deselect the active selection and make a bigger brush. Make sure your brush is at 100% opacity. So there's your brush opacity up there, or you can press 0 and that'll do that for you. And then we can brush over the whole of the sky. Even though we won't be bringing through all of the sky, we should brush over it for a consistency. And the water too. So I'm not taking my left mouse button off the mouse. It's just one smooth, continuous movement. Then I press Command and D or Control and D and that will deselect the active selection. And of course, I'll bring the opacity of this layer all the way down to, let's say, around 44. So we still got some information in the sky there, but it looks nice and natural. And I think that looks great. Okay, so I'm going to build the mask around the brighter exposure. I could probably do it around the base exposure as well, but that would probably include some of the water in the sky. So to build it around the brighter exposure, I make that exposure visible. And then I actually duplicate this brighter exposure layer. So I press Control and J or Command and J. See, we have 2 layers. One's just temporary. The other layer, the one that we've duplicated, I hold down Alt or Option on a Mac and create a black mask on that. You see, we have to duplicate this layer because if it's invisible, we can't build the mask around it. So this temporary layer just allows us to build that mask that we want. Now I often go for a darks one when I'm building dark masks because when we're blending brighter exposures and we're trying to select the darkest tones, we want our mask to be universally white. So really, really white in those darker tones. We want them to be as selected as possible. If they're not selected, so let's say we have our jetty here and you can see some parts are selected, some parts are grey, then that's going to create a really strange blend. One which will be very, very flat in the foreground. Let me give you an example of that. Let's say I'm going to choose this mask. It looks like we've selected the foreground, but actually what we've selected are the dark lines in between the wooden boards. So watch what happens if I press select. We can disable this bright mask and I'm going to press Control and H or Command and H. And watch when I paint in this selection. Look how flat the foreground's gone. And that's because we didn't create a mask that was universally white in the selected areas. In other words, in the shadows. So I'm going to press Control and D or Command and D. to deselect that selection. I'm going to delete this mask. I'm going to do the same thing again. So I'm going to create a black mask on that brighter exposure and go to darks 1 again. And this time I'm going to bring amplification all the way along. Now look at how white the jetty is. Let's do the same with smoothness. So we're going to really create a contrasting mask. I think that looks pretty good. So we can press select, delete this temporary layer. Then we can select the mask of that bright layer, press Ctrl and H or Command and H, and we can paint in the boardwalk. Now look how much more contrast and details we have that we didn't have before. It was a much more flat final result. I'm just going to paint the lighthouse in the background there as well. But now we have a much smoother final result. And it looks like we're also masking some of that water by accident, but that's okay because we're going to press Ctrl and D or Command and D. And just as before, we're going to bring down the opacity. All we want to do is just bring in a little bit of detail into the wooden boards. Too much detail and it looks a little bit surreal. We want to keep these areas a little bit dark. I think that's a bit too much. So bring the opacity down a touch just so we've got enough information in the wooden boards here. And there is before and after. We've brought back the sky and we've added some lovely details into the floorboards. Now if I were processing this image more, I press Command and D or Control and D, I'd do the contrast adjustment that I showed you previously. So I would press Control, Shift, Alt and E or Command, Shift, Option and E on a Mac, Control and J to duplicate that layer, change the blend mode of the top layer to Vivid Light. And if I were you, I would actually create an action for this. I have it available in Maya Pro 4 in the Filters and Finish tab under Detail Enhance, and that'll do everything for you. With the Vivid Light layer, I press Control and I or Command and I to invert that mask. Select both these layers, group them, and change the blend mode of that layer to Overlay. And with the inverted layer, we go to Filter, Blur, Surface Blur. And all I want to do is enhance the details, the local contrast in the foreground here. Let's see what happens if we move the sliders up a little bit more. And this is an intensive process, so it might slow your computer just a little bit. Right, I think we had it at a pretty good radius at 34. So I'm going to press OK, select the group, and put a black mask on the group there. Then with the white paintbrush, as always, we can paint in that contrast adjustment. And of course, it's a little bit strong, as it always will be. So we bring down the opacity of that layer. And there we go. We're just adding a little bit of contrast to that layer. And naturally, I would create a levels layer. Make sure we've got our contrast set well. There's bound to be some blacks in there, which is fine. As long as they're not too harsh. We don't want harsh shadows in our image. We can bring down the opacity of that levels layer. If it's a little bit contrasting, I think that looks good. And now just to look at the before and after. Here's before we exposure blended and added those 2 steps. And there's after. Very simple, but very effective. Now let's look at the night cityscape example that we've got for this video. So you should have 3 JPEGs that look like this. And please layer them in the same order that I've layered them. So I've got my base exposure on the bottom, as always, my darker exposure in the middle, and my brighter exposure on top. And the brighter exposure will be used just to bring back information in these trees. The darker exposure will be used to control the overexposed highlights and to reduce the sky. And the base exposure is there because it's the base exposure. That's the best exposure that we've got out of the 3. So to blend in the darker exposure, you remember in the Dubai example, in the last video we had a night cityscape and I created a really harsh mask to control for the lights in the buildings. Well, we're not going to do that now because as you can see in this base exposure, there's a huge amount of light pollution in the sky. It's really bright and that kills the mood in our night cityscape shots. This is Hong Kong, by the way, and it's an extremely bright city. So this is what we end up with. So to create a mask, of course, I'm going to create a black mask on this darker exposure, and I can make the darker exposure visible. Open Lumi 32, and we're going to create a relatively open brights mask. Now we don't want to affect the midtones in this brighter exposure, so we are going to bring our range down a little bit just so that we have more of our highlights selected and fewer midtones. And I think that looks pretty good actually. You can press select, Control and H or Command and H to hide the marching ants. Select the brush and a white brush and just paint across the image without taking your finger off the left mouse button. Then when you're done, you can do that again over the sky and over the buildings too, and one more time. And then press Command and D or Control and D to deselect that active selection and reduce the opacity of that darker exposure. So there's before and after. I think that's a little bit strong. Yeah, I think that looks good. Now for the brighter exposure, again, I'm going to create a black mask because we can build a decent mask of the shadows of the darker areas here around the trees on our base exposure. So we don't need to build it around our brighter exposure. And that's because the shadows in the base exposure are really dark, much darker than the tones around them. So in Lumi 32, let's see if we can make a good selection here. Now I'm going to cancel that and make my darker exposure invisible, and that will give us a better selection. So we just want to select the trees. Now that's selecting the buildings too, so why don't we try the different channels? The red channel selects more of the buildings. The green channel doesn't make a huge difference, and the blue channel doesn't either. So let's try lab mode. Now that's done a much better job. L has given us a greater selection of the trees. If I bring down the range, yeah, that's even better. And then the smoothness up. So we're looking to make the trees whiter and the buildings grayer. But I think I'm going to have to bring the range up a tiny bit more just to include more of the trees. Yeah. Okay, that's good. So I can press select, choose the mask of the brighter exposure, press Command and H or Control and H. With a white paintbrush, I'm going to make a smaller brush here. I can paint in the trees. Now we're going to want to do that a few times just to reinforce the selection. You want to bring as much of that brighter exposure through as possible. And I think that's good. So there's before and after. Naturally, we'll probably want to bring the opacity down just a tiny bit of that brighter exposure, not too much. Remember, the purpose of the trees here are more to frame the cityscape rather than anything else. They also add an interesting dynamic. You have this incredible collection of man-made structures surrounded by nature, and there are very few places in the world where you can get a photo like this. Now personally, if I wanted to continue processing this image, I would enhance the colors because it's a little bit flat. So I bring up vibrance and perhaps saturation a little bit. Now, I also think the cityscape's a little bit flat. So I'm going to create my usual vignette. And what I'm actually going to do here is bring down the sky a little bit more because we don't need it to be bright. It isn't serving any purpose at all. So we don't really want our viewers to pay much attention to it. We want our viewers to go straight to that vibrant cityscape below. So I create another curves layer, brighten up my midtones, press Control and I or Command and I to invert the mask. And then with a big brush, I just paint right across the cityscape. And you see we give it a beautiful glow. That's before and that's after. You see how important these vignettes are? I have a video on YouTube called The Power of Vignettes, which will show you more examples of how this really can change the dynamics of your photo. But we can see it right here. There's before and after. Now, if anyone would like to take this a little bit further, you can play around and create a new layer. And this is something we've done before. Change the blend mode of that layer to soft light. Have the foreground color kind of a blue like this. You can copy my code here. Press OK. And with the big brush again, we can paint right across the city. Of course, that looks crazy. Bring down the opacity quite a lot. Let's say to around 30%. Create a hue saturation layer. Clip that to the blue layer. And remember, we can change the hue of that layer to one that's better suited to this scene. So I think something like that. We can make it less saturated or more saturated. Let's sit somewhere in the middle. And we can increase the brightness a little bit too. So here is the before and after. You see, we're giving it kind of a cool, futuristic blue feel. And we can make that stronger by increasing the opacity, just so you can see it on the video there. Or we can, of course, reduce the opacity so it's less surreal. I wouldn't add more detail to these trees in the foreground because I think that would be too distracting. As they are, I think that works well. And as always, I'll finish my workflow with the levels adjustment layer if it's needed. I'm just going to bring up the highlights just a little bit, not too much. It's just a tiny increase. And so here is before and after. Before we had overexposed highlights and clipped shadows down in the foreground, and then after processing, we've ended up with a very balanced but cool cityscape. So for our next example, you should see 3 exposures in your folder, and this is from a mosque in Abu Dhabi. On top, you should see a base exposure, a darker exposure, then a brighter exposure. The very first thing I want to do in Adobe Camera Raw here is correct the color, because I think the lights in the mosque should be cooler. So I'm going to select all those layers, put the temperature at around 2650. So we've now got white interior lights. With the darker exposure, I'm also going to bring down the highlights because they're a little bit overexposed in that image. And I'll go to lens corrections, choose remove chromatic aberrations and enable profile corrections. Then I'll open images. So once you've stacked your images, we can unlock the background layer and put the base exposure at the bottom as always. Put the darker exposure in the middle and you've got the brighter exposure on top. So as we've done previously, we are going to blend in the darker exposure. And we're going to brush in the darker exposure because we don't want to affect the foreground with any mask, because the foreground is correctly exposed for. Often reflection in water is darker than the thing that it's reflecting. So it happens to have captured the lights perfectly in the water here, even if the interior lights are overexposed. So with the dark exposure selected, I'm going to create a black mask. Go to Lumi 32. And let's go for a contrasting brights mask. Let's go for a brights 3. So that's got a pretty good selection of the arches actually. Maybe some information at the top of the arch there in the center could be made a bit whiter, so I can bring amplification along, and that's done a pretty good job. Then I'll press select, choose the black mask, hold Control and H or Command and H to hide the marching ants, and with a single sweep of the brush, I bring back those lights. Very simple, but very effective. Now I would say that those lights are a little bit too dark, so I'm going to bring down the opacity of that darker exposure. We need to make it match or make sense in terms of brightness compared to the foreground. If it's too dark, it'll look odd. So now we want to build a mask which targets the darkest parts of the image because we want to blend in this brighter exposure. So if I do it on the bright exposure, if I build the mask around that, you'll see the areas that we want to select. So the walls up here and the foreground in the water, they are selected, but they're partially selected, especially the walls up here. Realistically, we want them to be white. We might mask them out later on down the line, but right now we want them to be as white as possible because that will create a less flattened response in the final result. Let me show you what I mean. If I press apply now and I zoom in, look at how we flattened some of the contrast. So look at the patterns here in this wall. You see, we've taken away some of that contrast. Now, if I delete this mask or disable the mask, you'll see we've still got some of that beautiful contrast there in the brighter exposure. But because of the way the images have blended, because the mask isn't fully targeting those areas, we create a much softer effect. Let me show you what happens if we build a more contrasting mask, a mask that targets the shadows better. Well, we know we can do that around our base exposure because our base exposure is darker than our brighter exposure. Show you what I mean. I'm going to do a darks 1 mask. And look at how white the tops of these buildings are now compared to the previous mask. To amplify that selection, I can bring amplification to the right. Then if we press apply and zoom in to that same area, look at those beautiful textures and details now. We're not killing them just because we're blending them in. If I disable the mask, you see it's the exact same textures from the brighter exposure that are now being blended into that base exposure. So when you want to create a mask selecting the darks, it's best to try and make it a really white mask. We don't want it to be as smooth and gradual as a darker mask. So let's look at our final result. This is our final result. And one thing I like from this brighter exposure is that we've brought information back in the foreground. You see these tiles under the water? They're not really visible in the base exposure. We've also stretched out these gorgeous highlights in the water. However, it goes without saying that this change is far too strong. So we can bring down the opacity of this brighter exposure, and I'm going to do it until or before we lose information in the foreground here in the swimming pool. But what that means is the top here, this wall, is a little bit too bright for my taste. So I'm going to select the mask of the brighter exposure, choose a brush with a foreground of black, press 5 on my keyboard, or change the opacity manually of the brush. So we've got an opacity of 50%. And then I'm going to paint out the mask up there. Just want to make it a little bit darker. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I don't want the areas up there to be too bright, because that will be too distracting. We want our viewers to look right in the center here at these lights and also the reflection. But if we have the top of these walls really bright, that's where our viewers' eyes will be pulled first. So I press Command and D and Control and D just to make sure I've got no active selections. And here's the before and after. Such a great job. Before exposure blending and after. So the next thing I would do in this example is I would make everything a little bit bigger. We don't really need all of these archways in here. We just need a small selection to carry the same effect. And in fact, it would have a better, stronger effect. So to do that effectively, first of all, let me select all of these layers, right click and choose link layers. So whatever changes we make to one layer, that will affect the rest of them. Then I'll go to the crop tool and choose straighten. And we want to make sure this line across the middle is perfectly straight. Then all the changes after that will be easier. Okay, that's good. We press OK. Now, I want to select these 5 arches. So that's what I'm really paying attention to. So I'm actually going to take the crop tool and cut right down the middle of these arches. Try and make it as symmetrical as possible. Press OK. And then I'm going to bring the top of the image down. And I'm trying to create roughly the same distance between the top of this arch and the top of the frame as the bottom of the arch in the reflection and the bottom of the frame there. Now I'm going to take my ruler and just look at this pillar to make sure it's straight. Let's zoom in a little bit to make sure there. It's pretty close. Let me take this ruler and compare it to this one. It's not too bad. We could probably play with it a little bit, bring it out a bit more, but I don't think we need to do that. And so by choosing a frame like this, we have a much stronger and impactful composition. But I'm probably going to bring this in a tiny bit more. Let's say the edge of the frame is going to meet the little point here in this archway. And we'll do exactly the same there. That's about right. Press OK. And I think that's much more impactful now. We're much closer to the scene, so we get a much more striking effect in the final result. In terms of processing, I'd probably leave this as it is. So there's before and there's after. We could, if you want, create the same type of vignette that I've created previously, just to make sure that people are looking straight at those strong lights in front of them, which I think they would be anyway. So I've created a curves layer and I'm just darkening the midtones quite a bit. Press Command and I or Control and I. With a white brush, I'm just going to paint along the top there. Let's choose 100% opacity. And just a little bit down here. Bring down the opacity of that quite a lot because it's a bit strong. And then with the new curves layer, we can just brighten up those midtones. Press Command and I or Control and I, and then we can run our brush right across the center here. So it's up to you if you think this looks better. Let's have a little look. It's before and after, before and after. And I actually think that does look better. So those are 3 different examples using 3 different types of scenes of how I would blend 3 exposures. Next, we're going to go into more complicated processes when exposure blending isn't as easy or as straightforward as the examples that I've given you.